Yeah, that was an odd experience to stand up here, and I'm much more comfortable with you here. You know, when I was a young preacher just starting out, and, Chris and I do go a long ways, and so he was probably there the first time I preached my first sermon, and I was probably there when he preached his. He was much more comfortable with it than I was, and I probably at that time would have loved to go into an empty auditorium and preach that way, but after doing it for so long, it's a little disconcerting, so I'm so glad to look out and see your faces here. All right, tonight I'm not just going to stand up here and preach, even though I'm from the pulpit. It's better for the camera and all that for me to be up here. But I'm going to ask you questions, and you're just going to yell out answers, okay? Don't be shy. Yell out what comes to mind. And let's learn a few things together, because my topic tonight is Aquila and Priscilla. Does anybody know how many times Aquila and Priscilla are mentioned in the Bible? Close. In 4, I believe, different scriptures, but a lot in one chapter. So a lot of our attention, you actually go ahead and be turning to Acts 18, where they're mentioned twice specifically in Acts 18. They're also mentioned in Romans 16. That's the other text that we're going to specifically look at. They're mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, I believe. And then, we're not really going to look at that verse that much. And then in 2 Timothy as well. All right, so I believe that was 4 times. Now, what's the thing that you've always heard that's peculiar about Aquila and Priscilla in the New Testament? What's the first thing that comes to mind that you've probably heard preacher after preacher say about? Let's go ahead and get it out of the way. Anybody remember? They're always mentioned together, right? Every class, every sermon I've ever heard about Aquila and Priscilla, that's been a big point of it. Now, it's not going to be the biggest point of it tonight, but it does deserve mentioning because they're peculiar in that way. You know, Peter had a wife. You know her name? I don't. Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians or maybe 2 Corinthians that he had the right to lead about a wife. It's in 1 Corinthians, I believe, chapter 9. He had the right to lead about a wife like Peter did. But we don't know her name. We know nothing about what she did for the Lord. We don't even know that she was a believer. I mean, I guess we can assume that because Peter was an elder, right? I think we can safely assume that, but we don't know anything. In fact, most of the time, we read about these great men of the New Testament and we have no idea who their wife is. And yet we do with Aquila. Aquila and Priscilla, everywhere they went, and we're going to travel with them tonight. Well, we're going to go to the different locations that they had a real big influence. And they're always together. You remember when Eve was created, God looked down and said it was not good that man was alone. I'm going to give him a help that is meet, an appropriate helper for him. And that's what Priscilla was. Always with him. When Aquila does something, it says that Priscilla did it too. And so it wasn't just that Aquila was there and he was the star of the show and Priscilla was sort of dragged along behind him. No. When they're going to take Apollos to the side, we're going to look at that more specifically here in a moment. When they took him off to the side and taught him the way of God more perfectly, it said Aquila and Priscilla did that. Both of them. What a great point for us tonight. And we should appreciate the helpers that God has given us and working for the Lord. Another thing that we should know about Aquila and Priscilla before we get started tonight is that we never hear of Aquila preaching. We read through the New Testament, we see example after example after example of great men who were preachers, who were apostles, who were elders and missionaries, and they seem to be sort of the stars of the show. There's not once in any of the accounts where they're mentioned where Aquila and Priscilla are sort of thought as the stars of the show. They play what seems to be a supporting role. And so from Aquila and Priscilla, it's easy for us all to relate to them. Now, as we study the Bible more, we understand that Paul was an ordinary person. Well, we put him up on a pedestal, but as you read about him, and especially in the text that we're going to read about him tonight, Paul was an ordinary person. He was exceptional at things, but the problems he had are the problems we have, right? Same with Peter. We can really perhaps see it more readily with Peter because we see all of his mistakes, right? In the gospel accounts, all the different mistakes that he made. It's like, yeah, I can relate to putting my foot in my mouth. I can relate to being rash. I can relate to not having a complete understanding and thinking that I can relate to those things. Well, we can all relate tonight to Aquila and Priscilla and the good that they do, especially for Paul. And so let's get into it. Let's turn to Acts 18, verses 1 through 17. And we're really going to have to squeeze everything out of these texts, okay, to get to the point of Aquila and Priscilla. Because, again, they're not the stars of this show. Paul is here. Paul's the main character. Aquila and Priscilla, in this text alone, seem to be sort of not even supporting cast, but they're mentioned. But as we go through it, we see that they play a big role in this. Paul is in Corinth. He has come from Athens. What has happened just before this is the great sermon on Mars Hill, and he has left there. He's arrived at Corinth. Now, let's think about Corinth for a moment. Corinth is the third largest city in the world at this time. Corinth is not some small podunk town. It is a huge metropolis full of people. And that's where Paul meets Aquila. Let's look at verse 2. Found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, lately come from Italy, with his wife Priscilla. And so we learn a few things about Aquila here, that he was born in Pontus, but he was living in Italy, especially Rome. He had been kicked out of Rome because that Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome. That's why Aquila and Priscilla are in Corinth, is because they were kicked out of Rome, because they had Jewish backgrounds. Now, when do Aquila and Priscilla become Christians? Does anybody know? Oh, come on. Surely you know this. No, nobody knows. We're never told. We're never told when they become Christians. I happen to think that it's right here. I can't prove that. But we don't have a conversion story for them. Why does Paul take it up with Aquila and Priscilla? Verse 3. What do they do for a living? They're tent makers. Now, another thing, how this is going to work tonight, I'm going to wait for the best answers, and then I'm going to pretend for the camera and for everybody on Facebook and all that I came up with it. All right? But they're tent makers, right? That one's easy. It's told to us right there in verse 3. Why does he come to Aquila and Priscilla? Because they're tent makers. And what is Paul? A tent maker. So here he is working with them. Now, that's going to become important in just a moment. All right, so we know about Aquila and Priscilla now. They're from Rome. They have Jewish backgrounds. We know that they become Christians at some point, if they were before this, or maybe while Paul is working with them, they become Christians. It's possible. We don't know. Now, mentioned before that Paul was an ordinary man. Let's look down at verses 9 and 10. This is after Paul has been in Corinth, staying with Aquila and Priscilla for a while, preaching and teaching in the synagogues. God speaks to him. Let's look at what he says. Be not afraid, but speak, and hold not thy peace. For I am with thee, and no man shall set on thee to hurt thee, for I have much people in this city. Be not afraid. What that means is don't be afraid any longer. That's sort of the tense of the verb there. Stop being afraid. You've been afraid, stop being afraid. We are given this view into Paul's soul at the moment. That Paul is filled with fear. Now, he's still been teaching. He's still been doing his work in the synagogues, trying to convince people to be Christians, and has reached a little bit of success. Crispus, the chief ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord, verse 8, with all of his house. And many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed and were baptized. Why is Paul afraid? Now, he has left the synagogue before this because they rejected the gospel message. What are some reasons? Shout them out. What are some reasons why you think Paul in this moment is afraid so much that God has to say, stop it. Don't be afraid anymore. I'm with you. Why do you think? All right, there's threats on his life. And we're not told that yet in this context, but the next few verses, they try to get him in trouble. What else? Because of his past, yeah, especially among the Jews, and his conversion out of that, and yeah, absolutely. Why else? Something very interesting. Before this, so in verse 1 it says, after these things, Paul departed from Athens. Now before this, Luke had been with him. Timothy and Silas had been with him. They're not with him right now. In the book of Acts, you should trace when the author says we did this, and then he says Paul did this. That's when Luke gets left behind somewhere. Luke has not come to Corinth with Paul. And Silas and Timothy do not arrive until verse 5. When Paul arrives in Corinth, he doesn't seem to have any of his companions with him. In the third largest city in the world. Right, he's alone. Now, from that time, he meets Aquila and Priscilla, and Silas and Timothy have shown up, but he starts out in Corinth alone. What's another reason why he might be afraid? What causes you fear? If you were to think of the things that causes people in general the most worry in life, what would it be? Finances. Does Paul have any money? Now, it doesn't tell us that directly. But notice, what does he do when he comes to Corinth? Does he start preaching? He goes back to tent making. Why? He didn't have any money. And where does money come from? Either somebody gives it to you or you have to earn it through working. So he goes to work. When Silas and Timothy come in verse 5, guess what he stops doing? Making tents. He has to earn money to live for a while until they come, and we don't know how long that was, but they come and now he has money. Most likely from support that Timothy and Silas brought him from other places. In 1 Corinthians 2:3, Paul says this about his time in Corinth. For I determined not to know anything among you save Jesus Christ and him crucified. And I was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. You know, we could also think about the potential of Paul having bad health problems. He had the thorn in his flesh that he wanted to be removed. We also know that he suffered a lot of persecution, had been beat many times. He probably wasn't the picture of great health, and that causes people worry. Maybe that was a problem, maybe not. But we know that Paul was fearful. But who was there for him? Well, we know that God was. But he's not the only one. What was that? Yeah. Then there was Silas and Timothy. Then there was Aquila and Priscilla. Imagine going into a place where you are a stranger. And you come here, it doesn't seem like the church had spread to Corinth yet. And you meet these two people who are, the only thing in common they seem to have is that they were Jews and that they were tent makers. And yet Aquila and Priscilla take Paul in. They could have told him, no, you keep on going. No, they took him in, allowed him to stay with them. He didn't just work with them, he stayed with them. We see this support system for Paul continuing to grow and grow. And we see that in these three letters in Romans and in 1 Corinthians and in 2 Timothy, where Paul mentions them by name, saying that either Aquila and Priscilla greet the church he's writing to, or he wants the person there to greet Aquila and Priscilla. This great friendship that is formed between these three people. This man who is wifeless, who is a stranger in this town, and Aquila and Priscilla show great hospitality, and they bring him in, and they support him. And then they do something truly amazing. What happens after God tells him that is that he continued there a year and 6 months. By the way, Corinth was a terrible city, known for its debauchery and sin. All right, this was a terrible place to live if you wanted to live morally. In fact, I was looking for different pictures of Corinth or artwork and architecture. I found that. But what I had to weed through is a lot of artwork about Corinth that I had to quickly scroll through because it was so known for its evil and lasciviousness and immorality. And that's where Paul went. That's where Aquila and Priscilla were. And he found shelter in their house. And they grow this great friendship together. And what happens after that is that the Jews come after Paul. They try to get him in trouble with the law, but the law don't care. They take him in front of the governor or magistrate there, and he's like, they're trying to get him in trouble for breaking the old law or the law of the Jews. And this Gentile governor of Corinth said, I don't care. You see to that. And then they end up getting in trouble. But anyway, study that sometime on your own. So Paul leaves Corinth. And so do Priscilla and Aquila. Let's start in verse 18. And Paul, after this, tarried yet a good while, and then took his leave of the brethren, and sailed thence unto Syria, and with him Priscilla and Aquila, having shorn his head in Cenchrea, for he had a vow. And he came to Ephesus and left them there, but he himself entered into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they desired him to tarry longer time with him, he consented not, but bade them farewell, saying, I must by all means keep this feast that cometh in Jerusalem, but I will return again unto you, if God will. And he sailed from Ephesus. Paul leaves the church at Corinth behind. Leaves, but you know who he doesn't leave behind? Aquila and Priscilla. These two, of course, had fled from Rome. Corinth wasn't their home. They're not leaving their permanent abode here, but they had stayed there the entire time that Paul had, for a year and 6 months, which was quite a while for Paul to stay at a place. But they leave on an unknown journey to be with Paul, to take the gospel to these people in Syria, and then they end up in Ephesus. Now, something is interesting here. Paul does not take them to the synagogue with him. He came to Ephesus and left them, Aquila and Priscilla, there. But he himself entered into the synagogue. I don't know why. Why did Aquila and Priscilla not accompany Paul to the synagogue? Why did he not want it that way? Let's speculate for a moment. Why do you think what's a possible reason why Paul would leave Aquila and Priscilla at home? And it specifically mentions he goes to the synagogue himself. What's that? I think he's trying to protect them. Because where Paul goes, it's been said wherever Paul goes, there's either a riot or a revival, right? Have you ever heard that? I think he's trying to protect them. That's my personal opinion. Because, as we're going to notice in just a moment, Aquila and Priscilla do go to the synagogue, just not with Paul. I wonder if it was Paul trying to especially protect Priscilla from violence. Possibly. The chivalrous man that I am likes to think so. That's right, I'm chivalrous, right? Yeah. Maybe that's what he's trying to do, because he didn't have a problem taking Timothy or Silas or any of those others. But he leaves them there. He's going to leave them behind again. Notice what we just read. Verse 20, when they... Now, that's either talking about the Jews that he had been reasoning with or Aquila and Priscilla. I believe it's Aquila and Priscilla. When they desired him to tarry longer time with them, he consented not, but bade them farewell and told them to stay while he went to Jerusalem. Aquila and Priscilla had left Corinth, had come to Ephesus. There were some other stops in there, it seems like, from the text. And then Paul goes to Jerusalem and says, no, you're not coming with me. You got to stay in Ephesus. Now, what's going to happen in Jerusalem? Riots. More violence. Paul's going to get arrested. I think he's protecting them here. Why specifically they needed protecting, I don't know. But he's protecting them. But they play a vital role in Ephesus. Extremely important what they do in Ephesus. Because they come across a young man who's zealous, who has all kinds of ability to do work for the Lord, but he's wrong. He's unable to do that work because he needs to know the gospel better. It's not his fault. He just hadn't been taught these things yet. His name is Apollos. Down in verse 24. A certain Jew named Apollos, born at Alexandria, an eloquent man, all right, so he could speak well, all right, so, not me. More like Chris. Apollos, an eloquent man, mighty in the scripture. So this man was full of knowledge. He had studied his Old Testament, right? He is mighty in the scriptures. He came to Ephesus. This man was instructed in the way of the Lord. All right, so he knew some things. And he was fervent in the Spirit. He spake and taught diligently the things of the Lord. And so I think the implication there is that he knew about Christ. And taught about Christ, but he didn't know the law of the New Testament yet. He knew the baptism of John. Now, that's the only thing we're told that he was short on, is that he didn't know about baptism into Christ for the remission of sins. He only knew about the baptism of John, which was also for the remission of sins, but had been done away once baptism into Christ had begun, right? So that's all he knows, and he is preaching that fervently and with zeal and great effectiveness. And he went into the synagogue, and he started speaking about it there. He spoke boldly. And Aquila and Priscilla heard it. They're in the synagogue this time. They heard it. They took him unto them. And it says, expounded unto him the way of God more perfectly. Aquila and Priscilla play such an important role here, especially for a young preacher who has great ability but is falling short. this is a role that my parents, I believe, really liked playing, and I saw them doing this many times growing up. Is that a lot of times at Bethel we had younger preachers, were smaller congregations than this, but a medium-sized congregation, I'd say. And so we had a lot of younger preachers, and if they saw them struggling, I saw with my own eyes many times Mom and Dad take them aside privately. You know what they didn't do? And what Aquila and Priscilla didn't do, and what you shouldn't do, is meet him at the doorway back there. And in front of a crowd, tell him all that he'd done wrong. Do you appreciate when people do that? No, I don't either. I don't either. And the way it comes off is, well, he just doesn't like to be criticized. Well, I don't like to be criticized in front of everybody and have to defend myself. Let's go to my office. Not my office, it's his office, but you know what I mean. Let's go to the office and let's talk about it. And if I need to correct something, I'll correct it. Although there's been a few times when I've been met back there and I was right and they were wrong. And I got to demonstrate that. It's bad that I take joy in that, right? I guess I shouldn't. But sometimes, a preacher needs to be corrected gently and in private. That's what Aquila and Priscilla did for Apollos here. And think about all the souls that were saved because they did that. Because they had this, what might have been an uncomfortable conversation. Again, we're never told that Aquila is any type of preacher or doctor of the law or any of that. They seem to be common people who were tent makers, who loved the Lord and knew about Him and knew about His Word. And they set this young man on the right track to where he could save no telling how many people. In 1 Corinthians, Apollos is mentioned right along Paul and Peter and the apostles. Not that he was an apostle, but he is mentioned on that level. You remember that the division that happened in Corinth, where some were saying, I'm a Paul and I'm a Peter, and what's the other one? I'm Apollos. Paul would later say that I have planted, and who watered? Apollos did. Now, how could he water in Corinth? Guess where Apollos goes after he's done in Ephesus? Where does he go? To Corinth. And waters what Paul had already planted. Why was he able to do that? Because of this quiet work that this godly couple did, where they took him aside and they taught him the way of God more perfectly. And to Apollos' credit, what did he do? He listened. He accepted the teaching. He listened. And so Aquila and Priscilla take us to Corinth, to Ephesus. They get to go back home. Let's turn to Romans 16. Romans 16, 3 through 5. So they go back to Rome because this seems to be after what had happened in Corinth and Ephesus. At some point, the persecution that was arising in Rome against the Jews had waned. And that's the way persecution went in the first century, the second and third century as well. There were times of hot, terrible persecution. And then there would be a Caesar that didn't really care that much, and persecution would wane. And then another Caesar would rise and persecute him. So most likely there's been a change here in Rome itself, and they were able to go back home. They don't get to stay there. But they're here at this time. In Romans 16, 3 through 5, greet Priscilla and Aquila, my helpers in Christ Jesus, who have for my life laid down their own necks, unto whom not only I give thanks, but also all the churches of the Gentiles. Likewise, greet the church that is in their house. By the way, when they're mentioned in 1 Corinthians 16, it's also, they have a church in their house there too. Where Aquila and Priscilla are, We know about their hospitality because they took Paul in, but they also hosted the church. Anyway, notice how Paul describes Priscilla and Aquila. How does he describe them? What are they? His helpers. I looked into this word, hoping to find that this word helpers had some awesome, rich, deep meaning. You know what it means? It means helpers. There's no deeper meaning to it. You know, we preachers like to dissect these texts and look deep and deep and deep. And sometimes a word just means exactly what it means, and there's no deeper anything to it. Helpers. They helped him. And we've already looked at how they've helped him. They took him in. They gave him a job. They gave him support. They gave him companions in travel. They gave him a trustworthy couple at places he left. You know, that might be why he left them in Ephesus instead of going on, allowing them to go on to Jerusalem. Maybe it was that was a great place for them to do work for the Lord, and Jerusalem wasn't going to be. Maybe that's why. But wherever they were left, they were continuing to help Paul because they had the same mission, the growth of the church and service to the Lord. What does Jesus say about the greatest love that man can have? What does he say? To die for his friends. Greater love had no man than this, that a man will lay down his life for his friends. I think that's John 15:13. Who have for my life laid down their own necks. I would look at that verse in John 15 and think, well, how am I ever going to actually be able to demonstrate that kind of love? How often is it the case that we actually have to lay down our life for somebody? Only once, right? Because I take things very literally. Aquila and Priscilla had already given up their lives for Paul. That's the meaning of it here. Who have for my life laid down not that they were willing to lay down their necks, they had already laid down their own necks. Well, we have the statement, we put our neck on the line for someone, right? That's what Aquila and Priscilla had done for Paul.
Probably more liberal than now. They would have to be good in it.
That's right. They actually had to put their neck out there. Yep. That's right. And whom not only I give thanks. You think about the eternal debt that Paul had to feel toward them, that he came to this huge city all alone and was seemingly broke, and they took him in. And then were companions to him. He said, I give thanks, but I'm not the only one. All the churches of the Gentiles. So here we have this couple. A simple couple, they're tent makers. They're a Jewish background, they've been kicked out of Rome, they've gone back home to Rome now. They've traveled with Paul. But their work was so great that Paul says all the Gentile churches owe a debt of gratitude to them. We're never told that Aquila was their preacher or an elder or anything like that. That those aren't the only people who do great and everlasting work for the Lord. That potential is with every single person. You know, sometimes we exalt people too much and the different roles that we have in the church. But you know, preachers very rarely actually grow a congregation. The congregation grows itself. You know, elders lead a congregation, but the members have to make it work, right? Can you be an Aquila and a Priscilla? Well, we have to behave like Aquila and Priscilla. That's the type of life we have to live. They did these things together. They did very simple things, taking Paul in. being a support to him. Taking this young preacher aside who was preaching something. I wonder how many people might have been there who knew that he was speaking something wrong but didn't say anything about it, right? But no, they took Apollos aside. And that quiet conversation that they had in the corner of the synagogue, how many souls were saved because it's just a simple thing. Letting the congregation meet at their house. Simple thing. But we pile simple things up and we have influence. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, Paul is about to die. He tells Timothy this in verses 6 through 8. His time has come to be offered, to depart. And so he gives Timothy all these different instructions about what he wants to do. We just had our gospel meeting at Ivy Bluff with Preston Silcox, and Preston Silcox, he was our preacher when we were at Bethel when we were growing up. Very important man to me, and I know to Chris as well. But he preached through 2 Timothy on Sunday night. And I put those online, by the way. Go check them out. But they're on the church's page. But we ought to read all of 2 Timothy with this in mind, that this is a letter to Timothy that's sort of a goodbye letter. It's a, I'm about to die letter. Please come to me quickly. Verse 19, salute Prisca and Aquila and the household of Onesiphorus. Now, they are in Ephesus. So they had left Ephesus, and maybe they went to other places, but they ended up back in Rome at home. Nero came up. And Nero started persecuting the Jews, and also Christians got swept into that persecution as well. And that's why Paul's about to die. But most likely that persecution drove Aquila and Priscilla out of Rome once again. And now they are in Ephesus with Timothy. I wonder what sort of influence they had on Timothy. I wonder if it's something very similar to what they had on Apollos and on Paul himself. But Paul wants this special message to be given to Aquila and Priscilla. Just salute them. Most likely this is going to be for the very last time. To these people who had meant so much to Paul. We're not told a whole lot about Aquila and Priscilla. There are some that we have to sort of read between the lines and sort of imagine putting ourselves in that situation. It's good always to do that. It's good to put ourselves in the text, in the event, and see what's going on. And there's room there for speculation, knowing that we are speculating about certain things, right? But we have to let our mind become alive in the situations that they are in. Not a lot of the words specifically told, but we know the impact that they've had. And it might be that at the end of your life, and all the good work that you've done for the Lord, there may only be a few specific things that people might know about, or talk about. But your influence is just as strong because of all the simple little things that most likely people forgot about. But all these simple little things that have piled up. And you have these people, this person who is so important to you. But you might not be able to think about a specific reason why. That's what Aquila and Priscilla are. That's what we must be. Pile up these simple things that we do to serve the Lord, and we'll have great influence on others. I appreciate your attention tonight.